I think in hunting, fishing, and in conservation, all three, when you elevate sportswomen's voices, you're telling a different story that allows other people to connect to the issue in ways that they hadn't before.
Hey, you're listening to Yonder Lies. I'm Hannah Haberman, and today we're excited to share a conversation I had with the amazing sportswoman and conservationist, Marcia Brownlee. Marcia is the project manager of a group called Artemis, which is doing some super powerful work to change the face of the outdoor world and the political world too, showing that sportswomen and conservationists do more than just hunt and fish. This statement from their website sums it up pretty well. Quote, "The complete sportswoman can skin a deer, land a burly brown trout, navigate in the wild, and she knows her game commissioners and politicians, knows wildlife laws, defends all wildlife, advocates on their behalf, and teaches others these skills." End quote. We haven't really touched on the intricacies and complexities of the world of hunting and fishing on the podcast yet, and without a doubt, these ways of living and identities play a huge role in the culture, politics, and the fate of public lands in the West, and all over the country. And one of the myths that's often applied to these worlds is that it's pretty much just men. Artemis proves this myth to be incorrect, and also shows that female hunters and anglers are deeply invested in the vitality and protection of the land around them. Marcia speaks beautifully about Artemis's mission, and about how she creates intimate and healing connections with the environment through hunting, fishing, and loving attention. In the second half of our conversation today, we talk about BLM oil and gas leasing sales in the time of COVID and the implications of these sales for public lands. We talk about why an antiquated system needs some important updates and how to navigate multi-use land management with grace and collaboration. With that, here's Marcia Brownlee.
My name is Marcia Brownlee. I am the program manager for Artemis Sportswomen, which is an initiative of the National Wildlife Federation that engages women hunters and anglers in conservation advocacy. I am currently based out of Missoula, Montana.
Awesome. That's a great place to dive in. Could you tell me a little bit more about Artemis? How did it get started, and kind of what does it aim to do in the world of sportswomen and in conservation?
Yeah, so Artemis began in the summer of 2017. And its genesis is that the National Wildlife Federation recognized the lack of sportswomen's voices in leadership in sporting conservation advocacy. And so our mission is really twofold. One, it is to create a community of sportswomen, as women hunters and anglers are the largest rising demographic in hunters and anglers across the country. One of our goals is to just kind of raise a rallying flag for women to talk to each other, support each other in the field, learn from each other, hear each other's stories. And that's both as hunters and anglers and as conservationists, to support each other in protecting the lands, waters, and wildlife that support our sporting heritage. And so what the National Wildlife Federation did is they brought together sportswomen from across the West as co-founders of Artemis. And those co-founders are amazing women, including Maggie Human, who lives and works in Jackson. So some of you may know her. They worked really hard to set the grounding values for Artemis to move forward on. And from there, we've expanded nationally. This year, we really opened up our network to a national audience and are continuing to grow and elevate and amplify the stories and voices of sportswomen.
That's awesome. Thanks for that background. And I personally am really into what you all are doing. And I think any organization that brings women together and empowers them to both be outside and be in that world as well as be in the public and political sphere is really awesome. So thank you for that.
That's a pleasure.
Totally. And I guess maybe to ask a little bit more about you, what was your journey about becoming a sportswoman and getting involved in this work, and maybe what does that identity mean to you?
Yeah, so I grew up in Michigan. My father was a hunter, but it was sort of a different hunting lifestyle than I am a part of now in Montana. It was a once a week hunting camp every hunting season that he would go off to with my grandpa and my uncle. And had I asked, he probably would have taken me and helped me learn how to hunt, but it didn't cross my mind to ask. It never even crossed my mind that that's something that I could do, because I didn't see anybody or any other women or girls doing it. but I grew up being very outdoors focused. We took a lot of camping trips. I've always been a hiker and a naturalist. My career path took me to education. I worked 15 years as an early childhood educator and school director, and then moved to Montana about 10 years ago. And when I moved here, I started fly fishing. I think it's required when you move to Montana. They give you a fly rod when you cross the border, and enjoyed that a lot. It's something I'm still learning and struggle with at times, but really just love the peace of being on the river and the experience of learning to know the cycles of the season and the habits of the fish. I think connected me to the river in ways that I hadn't previously. Previously, I felt like I was more of an observer, and this helped me get to know the river and the waterways much more intimately. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, my parents moved out to Montana shortly after I did, and my dad is currently a range master at a rifle range. He really enjoys shooting, and he hand loads his own ammunition and is very knowledgeable about it. And my mom was sick. She had Alzheimer's, and so he and I were working together to support her and to support each other through that decline. And I asked him to teach me how to shoot. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but wanted the two of us to spend time together positively. And I think as an early childhood educator, there's a book that's called If You Give a Mouse a Muffin. No, wait, If You Give a Moose a Muffin, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. There's two different books. And so I always joke that if you give a naturalist a rifle, she's going to want to take it hunting. And just the relationships in my life aligned perfectly at that time, where I was seeing somebody who was an avid hunter and was eager to take me along and kind of teach me the ropes of that first season. And then my father as well, who's a hunter. And so, I was lucky enough to harvest a deer my first season. And I think, it hooked me. I think it connected me to the landscape, as I mentioned, with the river in just a deeper, more intimate way than I'd ever experienced it before. And it changed my relationship to the natural world. And it was just a real necessary and profound support as I was during my mom's decline and her illness, to be in the natural spaces to process and to kind of insert myself into the cycle of life as a hunter. It was really powerful. And so I decided at that point to make a career switch to support more women to believe and have confidence in themselves in the field, and that this is something that they could do. And that just naturally led to a desire to have a more prominent role on the front lines of conservation and working to protect it.
Thank you. That is super beautiful. And I really appreciate just your attention to, how being in that world helps you be more intimate with the landscape. I think I grew up in Montana, and I'm also an amateur or a struggling fly fisher. So I feel you on that. And it is just a process that really helps people connect in really beautiful and unexpected ways. So
there's a poem. Well, actually, I don't think it's a poem. I think it's from Mary Oliver. I think it's in one of the books that she wrote. But the sentence is, "Attention is the beginning of devotion," and that really speaks to me as to how my relationship with the natural world changed when I became a hunter and an angler. It's just the attention is so much more focused that it deepens the intimacy and the devotion exponentially. In my experience, I know everybody experiences it a little bit differently, but that was definitely how it worked for me.
I love that. Yeah, I love Mary. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, both in your role with Artemis and also maybe in your own personal life, what are some of the challenges that you see in getting women involved in this field? And also on the flip side, what are some of the joys that come with creating and fostering these kind of communities?
Well, I'll start with the joys. Some of the joys, it's just, it's for me, it's almost the same joy that I had as an educator, where when you see something make sense to somebody, just that light bulb that shines, or how their eyes change in that moment. And I see that with women hunters and anglers and conservationists too. It's a realization that they haven't had before, and it can vary depending on what the experience is. But we did a turkey hunt in Idaho a couple of years ago, and we brought together 10 sportswomen from really, I mean, mostly across Idaho and Montana, but they came from all over to hunt turkeys for a weekend on public land in Idaho. And all of these women were women who had hunted before. Some of them hadn't hunted turkeys, but they were all experienced hunters. And to hear the conversation, which was largely, I've been hunting my whole life, but I've never hunted with other women before. And so for those of us who have been hunting, that's the case. It's oftentimes it's really hard to find other women to hunt with. And so building those relationships and having those connections and seeing how the experience is different than what they're used to is a big joy. And same with conservation, to support people to raise their voice, no matter how terrifying it can be to speak at a community meeting for the first time or to do a radio interview for the first time. The gratification that comes from knowing that you spoke up and could have an impact is really joyful to be a part of. Challenges, I think, for everybody, and I think for women, perhaps particularly, it's time and energy, right? Attention and time is the most valuable resource that people have, and there are a lot of things competing for it. I'm lucky enough to be a conservationist for my full-time job, so I get to dedicate a large portion of my time to it. But a lot of the women we work with, they have a ton of other obligations, whether it's being a student or working full-time or having a family. We have one of our most active volunteers. She's a nurse with 2 kids, and so developing a program and support systems to allow her to participate in a meaningful way and alongside her other obligations is always a challenge. And I also think the conservation issues that we deal with are incredibly complex. And I know personally, I only started to really dig into conservation when I took over as Artemis program manager. And the learning curve is steep. These issues impact all areas of our country and our lives, both economically and our health, and it's complex. And so communicating in a way that's meaningful and also digestible is a challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate time and attention, like you said, being 2 of the most important resources we have. I think that's very, very real and resonates for sure. I'm wondering, I know one of Artemis's goals, as you kind of touched on, is supporting women to be in both in leadership positions, both in conservation and also in hunting and angling. And I'm just curious how you think including more women in these conversations and in these spaces changes the norms of these communities and shapes them in different ways.
I think anytime you include new voices on an issue, you're bound to change the culture of that issue, and you're bound to connect with other people on that issue. I think in hunting, fishing, and in conservation, all 3, when you elevate sportswomen's voices, you're telling a different story that allows other people to connect to the issue in ways that they hadn't before. I think it changes the way that everybody is allowed is a strong word, but allowed or given space to talk about hunting and fishing and conservation. We can talk about hunting more as a connection to our food, as a connection to the habitat, as a connection to our history, and we're able to talk about it emotionally in a way that sportsmen unfortunately aren't. They have the same experiences and the same connection that we do, but aren't often given the space to talk about it in the same way. And so I think by adding more voices, we're able to broaden how we talk about it and maybe allow or enable other people to see themselves as hunters, anglers, and conservationists as well. And it's the same with conservation. If we, to a certain extent, the story can get redundant and it can get monotonous. And when you open up the doors and include more voices, you stop that stagnation and allow the conversation to continue to evolve and hopefully maybe a viewpoint that resonates deeply and changes a mind.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome part of the work that you all do is just creating space for new narratives and creating new spaces for more people to be included in these spaces and take ownership in those spaces. I think that's really powerful and awesome.
Support for Yonder Lies comes from Think WY. Wyoming Humanities. Wyoming Humanities supports programs, grants, and initiatives in Teton County and across Wyoming that explore history, culture, and the human experience. To learn more about the Wyoming Humanities Council, visit thinkwy.org. Again, that's thinkwy.org.
I want to jump a little bit towards talking more about public lands and oil and gas lease sales. And maybe before we dive in too deep, if you could give us a little Spark Notes version, maybe for people who don't know very much about oil and gas lease sales, what they are, how they happen, where they happen, and kind of who are the different players involved in that process.
Yeah, so the oil and gas leasing sales happen mostly on the Bureau of Land Management land. And so the process is that anybody can nominate a parcel on Bureau of Land Management land to be offered up for auction. And, it goes through a comment period. There's an environmental impact statement, a comment period, a protest period, and then it gets put up for auction for oil industry and energy speculators to bid on. And, Artemis supports the multi-use of our public lands. We support oil and gas development on our public lands, but right now there's an energy dominance agenda that prioritizes oil and gas development over all other uses, and that's at the expense of conservation. It's at the expense of grazing, ranching. All other uses of our public lands are sidelined for the focus of energy dominance and development. And so when those parcels go up for auction, right now they're governed by policies that were put in place in 1920. The financial system that governs our auction sales was literally set in 1920. And then, other prices are in processes were from 1987. So we've got an antiquated process and an antiquated system that's 50 to 100 years old and is not paying attention to the benefits that we get from oil and gas leasing as a taxpayer, and it's not balancing the multi-use and conservation priorities of our public lands. And so right now, Artemis in particular is calling on the administration to pause, to stop leasing during the pandemic, given that the oil market is really, really down and the industry is not currently leasing. And so what is being sold at below market prices and being scooped up by energy speculators. So we want them to stop for now and really focus on updating the system and the policies to be more reflective of balanced development and current market prices.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that summary. I think particularly in Wyoming, I know these BLM sales are especially relevant because BLM oversees so much of Wyoming's land. I think they oversee about 18 million surface acres, which is a pretty big part of Wyoming's 62 million. Can't really do the math in my head, but it's almost a quarter, if not more than a quarter. And I'm wondering, you're talking about a lot of these structures being set up in the 20s and in the late 80s, which is really baffling to me. I didn't know that. And I'm curious what some of those updates and kind of bringing this process into the present day, what in your opinion that could look like.
Yeah, so, there's 3 points that we're focusing on right now, and all 3 have bills that have been introduced by senators across the country. And so the first one is a bill called End Speculative Oil and Gas Leasing Act of 2020, and it was introduced by Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada. And this is a low potential lands bill. So essentially it would require our public lands to be assessed for their potential as a source of oil and gas. And then it would not allow leases on lands that have low or no potential. So I mentioned before that, they do go through a bit of an environmental impact statement, but they are not assessed for their potential as a resource. And so for me, this is common sense legislation to make sure that we only lease land that has a real chance of being developed. This bill would allow the Bureau of Land Management to prioritize oil and gas development in areas with the highest economic value, and it would then free up low potential lands to be managed for wildlife habitat conservation and for recreation. And then there's the Fair Returns for Public Lands Act, and this is a bipartisan bill introduced by Democratic Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico and Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. And this bill is aimed at restoring fiscal responsibility by making sure oil and gas companies pay a fair market price for extracting resources. So current royalty rates, as I mentioned, were set in 1920. They are set at 12.5%. And this bill would raise royalty rates to 18.75%, which is actually the current rate oil companies pay for offshore leasing. So it's just bringing onshore leasing and offshore leasing up to the same royalty rate. This bill would also increase the minimum bid for leases from the current price of $2 an acre to $10 an acre. And, according to reports, this would increase federal revenues by $20 to $38 million a year, with a similar amount flowing to states. And so really this just modernizes our leasing costs to reflect current market value and make sure that as taxpayers, we're getting value for the resource that we deserve.
I think every time I've talked to folks about this, at least here in Wyoming, people are really shocked to learn that land is being sold for $2 an acre. I mean, I think so many people here take so much pride in our public land and think that it probably is worth a lot more than $2 an acre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm curious, in doing this work and trying to create more awareness, if you found that this is an issue that a lot of people in Wyoming and throughout the West are tuned into, or if you think it's something that a lot of people don't have on their radar.
I think it's an issue a lot of people don't have on their radar yet. I think conversation around it is increasing, especially with the introduction of these bills, but awareness is still growing. I think people don't often pay much attention to the benefits we as taxpayers get when leasing on public land. And so spreading awareness and education on that is a really important first step.
Totally. And if you could maybe just one more time outline what are those benefits in terms of tax revenue that we're either losing or gaining in this process as citizens benefiting from these public lands? Yeah,
so again, with this bill, it would increase royalty rates to 18.75%. And so a royalty is really a tax that's put on any oil and gas that's produced off of our public lands. And so by taking away the option to lease low potential lands, which would have practically no benefit to the taxpayer, we're removing a lot of administrative costs. And then by increasing the royalty rate to a fair market price, it just expands our opportunity to reinvest that money in the work that we do. The offshore leasing that I mentioned before with the royalty rate of 18.75%, that's what funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And so increasing our royalty rates really just expands our capacity. And again, this benefits both federal revenue and state revenue. And then $2 to $10 an acre, it doesn't seem like much necessarily, but when we're talking about the numbers of acres that are leased, it adds up quickly. And that's the minimum starting bid. And I don't know, I just think about if I had the ability to buy land at prices that were set in 1920, and then if, as an energy speculator, turn around and sell it at 2020 prices, it's just a system that needs to be fixed.
100 years of inflation not really being accounted for.
Exactly.
One thing I appreciated that you mentioned earlier is Artemis's support of the multi-use land approach that the BLM is so known for and has to manage. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what balancing all of these different uses really looks like in terms of advocacy work and the conversations between, folks who are trying to support and grow recreation, folks who are interested in wildlife conservation, the needs of the energy industry. How can we move towards a more equitable balance in this multi-use framework?
Mm-hmm. So I think the first step is bringing everybody to the table, right, and making sure that this is a conversation and less of a debate and more of a conversation. And I think, as with everything, right, when we're trying to negotiate multi-use of a system, there's going to be a little give and take. So not everybody's going to get their way 100% of the time. But if they feel like they're engaged in the conversation and listened to, then that balance is more likely to happen. And I think the first step is really looking at the very specific landscape that we're talking about Is it critical habitat for an animal such as the sage grouse? Is it in the middle of a migration corridor for our mule deer? Is it calving habitat for elk? Really looking at the value of that land and what makes the most sense, not just for today, but for the next 100 years. If we develop in the middle of this critical habitat, will it recover? How long will it take to recover? What are we losing in the meantime? And I think balancing the economic benefits that we get from it as well is important. Oil and gas development is incredibly important to economies here in the West. So is outdoor recreation, and maintaining the health and vitality of those lands, waters, and wildlife is incredibly important to maintaining that outdoor recreation economy, to maintaining the state-based income we get from hunting and fishing license sales. And so we really just need a full perspective approach.
I agree 100% with that. And having that more holistic framework is hard and challenging, and also so important, I think, for moving forward. I'm wondering, as we move towards wrapping up, if you could summarize if there was one thing or a few things that you really hope listeners could take away from this conversation in regards to oil and gas leasing sales, and just in regards to thinking about advocating for public lands and working in this multi-use world moving forward.
Oh, goodness. Collaboration. I mean, that's a word that guides me a lot, both personally and professionally. But I think, again, right now, the energy dominance approach to our development is very, very one-sided. And as we move forward, we really need to embrace collaboration and embrace collaborative decision-making.
Yeah, it's a hard skill to learn and a hard skill to practice, but
it's a hard skill to make policy around too.
Totally. Well, Marcia, thank you so much for spending a little time talking this morning. I have really appreciated both learning a little more about Artemis and all the awesome work you all are doing, and also learning a little bit more about oil and gas leasing sales. And I think I just want to say, as a woman who also spends time outside, I just really appreciate all the work you're doing to create these communities and to empower folks to speak up in the public sphere. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful talking with you.
I wanted to end today's episode with an excerpt from the essay Marcia mentioned in our conversation today. Here's a piece from Upstream by Mary Oliver. Sometimes the desire to be lost again, as long ago, comes over me like a vapor. With growth into adulthood, responsibilities claimed me, so many heavy coats. I didn't choose them, I don't fault them, but it took time to reject them. Now in the spring I kneel, I put my face into the packets of violets, the dampness, the freshness, the sense of everness. Something is wrong, I know it, if I don't keep my attention on eternity. May I be the tiniest nail in the house of the universe, tiny but useful. May I stay forever in the stream. May I look down upon the windflower and the bull thistle and the coreopsis with the greatest respect. Teach the children. We don't matter so much, but the children do. Show them daisies and the pale hepatica. Teach them the taste of sassafras and wintergreen, the lives of the blue sailors, mallow, sunbursts, the moccasin flowers, and the frisky ones, inkberry, lamb's quarters, blueberries, and the aromatic ones, rosemary, oregano. Give them peppermint to put in their pockets as they go to school. Give them the fields and the woods and the possibility of the world salvaged from the lords of profit. Stand them in the stream, head them upstream, rejoice as they learn to love this green space they live in, its sticks and leaves, and then the silent, beautiful blossoms. Attention is the beginning of devotion. Technical support comes from Jackson's community radio station, KHOL 89.1, and the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. A big thanks to the Jackson Hole Historical Society for providing access to hours of archival audio. Special shout out to Doug Haberman for our theme music and Becca Holt-Hewson for our beautiful cover art.
If you haven't already, please rate and subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. And if you'd like to support the show with a small monthly donation, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/yonderlies. That's patreon.com/yonderlies.